In my, at this point, quite extensive experience being in the Jock Studio fandom, I think I saw one topic create more confusion than anything else, and since I assume you saw the title, you know where this is going. So, to understand this game functionalities, the first thing you need to clear up is the ability to pair up two jocks together is indeed divided into two distinct mechanics. The first one is player choice pairings, of which the description on the official website states Ace, as the director, can pair recruited actors during the filming phase, creating at least 9 new erotic illustrations with animation and voice acting, influenced by the character statistics. The 9 illustrations mentioned above probably correspond to the 9 pairing listed right below, with each individual jock having 3 pairings he can be a part of. But when it comes to the context that these jocks will be paired up in, a pretty quick and safe deduction we can make is that the ability to make these pairs is tied to the film minigame we already experienced in Demo 2. However, one might point out that technically, the film minigame already allowed us to pair jocks together, and it is not restricted to the pair listed here. And although that's a correct observation, you need to keep in mind that the description of this dynamic specifically mentions erotic illustrations, also known as the CGs you'd already be familiar with if you have watched my previous video where I discussed them. But for clarity's sake, they are basically the full screen drawings we see throughout the story. However, the filming minigame in its current form doesn't work off illustration, but rather it works via the programmable puppets that are specifically designed to give the minigames as much flexibility as possible. So for now, keep in mind that the integration of 9 new CGs into the filming minigame is related to the player choice pairings mechanic, which is important to not mix up with the matchmaking mechanic. These two mechanics do have their similarities and points where they will overlap, as we'll soon see, but for now it's important to differentiate the two of them, because we just saw the player choice pairing relates to the recording of sex scenes at the studio, while the description of the website for the matchmaking says, as Ace, play the matchmaker and pair the unpursued jocks together romantically, ensure that everyone, not just Ace and his love interest, get a happy ending, includes new dialogue, voice acting and scenarios. As you can see, the matchmaker is instead a mechanic that will allow for the jocks that are not romancing Ace to be paired up with each other, and if we as the player will manage to play Cupid successfully, we'll probably be rewarded with new and exclusive scenes that will center around the new happy couple we created. So matchmaker is about the romantic side of things, while player choice pairings are instead about the sexual side. These two mechanics, as per what can be understood by the description, seem to be entirely optional, so when you play the game, you will be able to use both, only one, or none of them, as you'll see fit. To understand how they'll actually work, however, we need to recap a bit the game's mechanics and how we'll see them get expanded on in the final game. As I'm sure you remember, if we look through Ace's contact in the menu, we can see a big heart that is the affection meter that increases and decreases the more Ace interacts, successfully or unsuccessfully, with the respective jock. What you might have missed, however, is that technically, the jocks also have affection levels between each other. In fact, whenever the jocks share an activity in the minigames, there is a small hidden chance that one of the boosts gained from the activity will be an increase of the affection between the characters that shared said activity. In this example, as you can see, the jocks all performed the same workout, and as a result, most of them came out with boost to their affection with other members of the group. Sadly, there is no way for us to see the current affection level between the jocks in the demo, probably due to the fact that, beyond probably serving as a small multiplier in the score for the film minigames, the potential application for the jock-on-jock affection in the demos are incredibly limited, so they likely didn't bother to implement a system to make that stat visible. But regardless, the notion of an affection stat between the jocks is probably the fundamental building block for both the player choice pairings and the matchmaking mechanics. As a result, in the final game we'll need a lot more ways to boost up the affection between the jocks our choosing. Just making them share a workout or a filming session is probably not enough, and the most direct way seems to be already evident from Demo 2. During the event where Ace meets two of the jocks as they are doing something together, the game will offer the player 3 potential dialogue options, with 2 of them increasing the affection between Ace and one of the jocks, since they make Ace say something that endears him to specifically one half of the pair, and a third option in which basically Ace just shifts the 2 of them together. This appears to be the only intentional and direct way with which the player can increase the jock-on-jock affections in the demo. But as I said, in the final game, there will be probably other ways to do this, which will not be based off of scripted events. One among these options could be giving the jock an item from Ace's bag and suggesting he'll gift it to our desired boyfriend for him. However, an important distinction to make is that it will not be possible to matchmake literally any two jocks together, since that would require an amount of work that would in all likeness be just too much on the devs. So which couples would be the ones that Ace can pair up? Luckily, we don't need to look too far to find an answer, since I think it's pretty straightforwardly given to us when you consider that the pairs we got to see in Demo 2, so Derek and Bryce, Leo and Zane, and Avan and Yuto, are described by the devs in their 2024 Q&A as the most compatible couples.
The ones that we are showing are our most compatible pairings, but we do plan to create something out of the matchmaker.
And oh, would you look at that! They also happen to be the first 3 pairs listed among the Player's Choice Pairings list. Consequently, it seems rather obvious that the couples will be the same between both mechanics. So with that out of the way, let's put aside for a moment the potential ways these two features might interact with each other in light of sharing the same pairs, since knowing the exact couples allow us to create a concrete example on how these features might work in any given playthrough of the final game, which I personally think is the best way to understand these mechanics, since otherwise I think it'd be rather difficult to imagine. So let's suppose I start a new save file in the final game, and I decided I want for Zane to be Ace's partner, and I also decide I want for Bryce and Derek to be a couple and for Yuto and Avan to also be a couple. Let's stick with the pairings showcase in Demo 2 for simplicity's sake, but as I mentioned already, these will not be the only options. At the start of the game, I will make sure to fill up to the max Zane's affection meter with Ace, but I will also make sure to be present at all the events for Bryce and Derek, Avan and Yuto, and even Zane and Leo. I'll get to the why for this last one in a moment. But for now, keep in mind that these first sets of events are likely to be just considered friendship events, similar to the ones we already got to see in Demo 2. And so, even if a perverted mind such as Ace's might always see something naughty in them, in practice they won't extend past a basic platonic relationship. As we progress through the game, we'll encounter the root lock, the point in time in which the game will check our affection status with the love interest and lock us into the root with the highest affection score. In light of the fact that root locking the player will remove a jock from the pool of available partners for the rest of the love interest, it's also likely that the game will check at this same time the affection meters between the rest of the jocks, and if any meter is high enough, let's say it's past the 30 out of 100 points mark, the game will then lock those same couples in. In our case, this means that the game will see the Bryce and Derek, Yuto and Avan, and Zane and Leo affection meters as above 30, so it will proceed to lock in the former two, but not Leo and Zane, since even if they do meet the required affection, the game will likely prioritize Zane being paired up with the player, and thus the Leo and Zane pair will not be locked in. However, this doesn't mean that we'll be able to create couples so quickly, especially since the root lock is likely to happen by week 2, or still very early on in the game, as I've explained in my timeline video. As such, instead of instantly creating the couples, the partner locks for the jocks we decided to not make into Ace's boyfriend will merely open up a new set of more overtly romantic events the player can assist to, and consequently, influence to make sure that their ships are gonna sail. So let's say that I play through the rest of the game up until it's almost over. In the course of this time, I made it sure to take every possible opportunity to raise the Derek and Bryce affection meter, bringing it to 100 out of 100. But in doing so, I forgot to do the same with Avan and Yuto's, who only got up to 40-100, let's say. This means that towards the end of the game, the player will be treated to a special Derek and Bryce scene with new dialogues and new voice acting, in which they'll make their relationship official and probably thank Ace for having been their cupid. As a reward for having managed to successfully matchmake Derek and Bryce, I think it's likely that the player will possibly pair up in the game will get their own version. However, since we didn't manage to raise Avan and Yuto's affection to 100 as well, then this probably means we will not be treated to an equivalent scene or set of scenes for their couple, since we just didn't do enough to make them get together. Now of course, the exact details on how this process will work are bound to vary in the final game compared to what I described right here, but overall this should give you a general idea on how the matchmaking will end up working. But if you remember, I mentioned how the matchmaking and the player's choice pairing features might end up intersecting at some point. That's because I think it's probable, maybe even likely, that unlocking the sex CG associated to a couple might serve as the biggest possible affection boost the player has access to, since the process of unlocking the player choice pairing CG should technically be rewarded gameplay-wise in some way. In light of this, how will player choice pairings work? Well, for starters, I do think that they will also need a minimum affection requirement between the participating jocks, which will not be as high as the one needed for the start of a romance, but it will still be present nonetheless. But beyond that, what else could be needed to trigger a jock-on-jock CG during filming? Well, I think that the most immediate answer would be having a high score, if not the highest possible score when playing the filming minigame. If you remember from Demo 2, the game scores your filming performances from 1 to 3 stars, but in actuality it's more like 6 stars, since you can also upgrade the stars to be Rainbow Star if you keep on scoring points. And to that you might say easy enough, since from playing Demo 2 you know that it's relatively easy to achieve even 3 Rainbow Stars if the affection between a jock and date is high enough. So you just have to make sure that the jocks you wanna unlock the CG for also have high affection between them. This reasoning is correct, but it's easier said than done, since if you remember in my timeline video I mentioned how the minigame Demo 2 is probably very rigged, for the purpose of better representing how the gameplay experience will look like in a more advanced state of the final game, rather than keeping the demo player stuck with the level 1 version of the minigame, which of course wouldn't be as fun. So don't expect being able to score 6 stars as soon as you start a new game. The first few times when you'll play the filming minigame in the final game, you'll probably not be allowed to go past 3 stars at most, since you lack the needed multipliers to go beyond that. Having as such established the requirement for affection and the minigame score, it might be easy to think we are done here, but there could be one last requirement we'll need to fulfill, that being a stat requirement. I'm of course talking about the stats we already gotten familiar with in Demo 2, but why am I saying that? Well, the point of the stats and the puppets of the filming minigame at large is the ability to essentially customize your set of pawn actors in whichever way you'd want. But to do so, as you might remember from Demo 2, there is a minimum stat requirement that needs to be reached for a position to be performed successfully. And while in Demo 2, every sex position always required for both guys to have raised the same stat, we know that in the final game, there will be also sex positions which will have different stat requirements between the guided bottoms and the guided tops. We can see an example of such case in this picture taken from the 2-year dev update, where the move chest grip seemingly requires the top to have a high stamina and for the bottom to have a high skill. And even in the likely scenario that what's shown in this picture is an unfinished menu, since the name of the move alone is repeated multiple times, it's basically a guarantee in my opinion that there will be sex positions requiring different skills from the parties involved, because otherwise the switch button during filming would basically just have no gameplay purpose and be just an aesthetic change. The relevance of this stems from the fact that although the puppets offer in theory endless combination of positions for a couple, the CGs that the dev team can produce are limited to 1 per pair, so it wouldn't make sense if, for example, we ended up training Leo as a top and Zane as a bottom, only for the CG between them to have Zane top despite not having allocated any points in his stats to perform as a top. As such, it is likely that the game will allow one of those CGs to be triggered only if it sees that the characters in question have the right amount of stats points allocated in the correct stats. For an easy point of reference, think of it like the donuts in the Pokemon Legends ZA DLC, where you can only make certain special donuts only if you satisfy the stats requirement the game gives to you. But how will you know that in Jock Studio you have reached the correct stat requirement, since the stats don't even show up with a numerical number? Well, I might be veering more into the speculation territory with what I'm about to say, but I think that learning which stats need to be increased for each pair, without the external support of the internet, would require the player to engage with the social mechanics of the game. I assume in fact that the affection of the other jocks with Ace won't magically just disappear once Ace gets root locked with a love interest specifically, but it will more likely just be turned into platonic affection that can still be increased by interacting with them, and one of the benefits of doing so will be learning about your club members' like and dislikes, including what sex positions they might prefer. Let's make an example. We decided to unlock a player choice pairing that involves a van, but we don't know what to do to unlock any of the possible ones. So the first thing we do is to get to know a van and learn what his favorite sex positions are. Which, for the sake of our example, let's say that the 3 positions a van like the most are missionary as a bottom, cowboy as a bottom, and sideways as a top. We then go talk to Zane to see if their tastes match, but he tells us he likes different positions or the same position in the same role as a van, so the two of them are not compatible. If we talk to Derek instead, he'll say that he likes 2 different positions from a Vans, but his third position of choice is missionary as a top, so him and a van are a possible match. Same logic applies to all the other Jocks, since if all of them have 3 favorite positions, with top in a position and bottom in a position being considered compatible variation of the same position, it will allow us to have the 9 pairing listed with all a different position between each other. So once we understood how Van and Derek are compatible, we make sure to train up the 2 of them in their respective stat to better perform in their position of choice. We also raise the affection between the 2 of them to reach the minimum requirement, and we make sure to give a 6-star performance during the actual minigame. And as a side note, another requirement could also be putting them in a specific outfit, but I wouldn't bet on it for now. If we have done everything right, after the minigame is over, Jack will say something along the lines of "Oh, Derek, Van, you really are fired up, wanna go for an extra round?" Which will lead us to being able to view the actual CG of the 2 of them having sex. It's also important to note that there also probably won't be a set number of this kind of CGs you'll be able to unlock in a single playthrough, since they are not about a committed romantic relationship but rather about simply recording a scene. I think it's likely that you'll even be able to unlock all 9 of them in a single playthrough of the game if you play your cards right. Lastly, tying back to what I said at the start about these 2 mechanics being connected, unlocking DCG for one of the possible couples might either be a requirement or a big helping hand in creating the matchmaking couples, since unlocking this scene will at least for sure grant a big affection boost between the involved Jocks. That about concludes what we can say for somewhat certain about these 2 mechanics. However, there is one last point I wanted to touch on, but that, unlike what I've mentioned above, would basically be entirely speculation, from the moment that this potential gameplay option has never been even vaguely hinted by the devs. But at the same time, not including this speculative feature would perhaps leave the matchmaking mechanics specifically feel a bit incomplete. I'm of course thinking about the fact that if you pair a group of 7 in pairs of 2, one is gonna be inevitably left out, which is exactly what happens if the player decides to create all the couples they can during a playthrough. Since Ace takes one of the Jocks for himself, he can then only pair 4 Jocks in couples of 2, leaving one of the guys inevitably left out, which again would feel a bit odd when the goal of the website specifically says that everyone will get a happy ending with this mechanic. So what gives? Is there a way to work around the math of an odd number of characters while also at the same time giving the last remaining Jock a partner as a kind of consolation prize? Well, some of you might think that you could perhaps turn one of the couples in a throuple, but as far as I can tell, even if the Jocks are down for threesomes on camera, none of them seem interested in poly relationships, so that's not possible in principle, I think. The most likely option to address this gap, in my opinion, is to create a sort of mini matchmaking event for the remaining Jock, in the sense that if, for example, the player pairs everyone up in such a way that Derek is the only one being left out, this will unlock an event where Derek talks to Ace on how he feels a bit lonely for being the only one who didn't find love at the studio. Once we'll have learned this info, if we so desire, we'll be able to trigger a small series of scripted events, emphasis on the small since it'll be considerably shorter compared to the full-on matchmaking process, where Ace pulls some strings, and as a result, Derek will end up saying, "Oh yeah, I asked out X person, thanks for your help Ace, I hope things work out between us." So again, it'd be much shorter, it wouldn't actually portray the romance between the left out Jock and his potential partner, but it would be enough to just tie up the loose end that the matchmaking mechanics leaves out. That said, on the identity of this X person or left out Jock can date, my guess is as good as any. If we exclude the option that the devs will simply chuck it up to being a faceless nobody they met on a dating app, which is probable but a little boring, then we need at least 6 suitable candidates, because every Jock will need his own personal candidate, among the sidecast, which is easier said than done, especially when you remember that Jock Studio works off a sexuality logic that is closer to real life than the everyone is gay we saw in Compatibility. So pairing up 2 guys, it's not as easy as just finding another pair of walking balls. As such, these candidates need to both be queer men and also make logical sense as partners. It'd feel like an enormous ass pull if a character established to be straight in every other scenario would also conveniently discover himself as queer as soon as the love interest needs a partner. Same logic on why you couldn't pair up two characters that might have an antagonistic relationship with each other. You can't hand-wave their rivalry away with a few lines of dialogue just because a jock needs a partner pronto. So this emergency partner role can't be exactly filled by anybody, but I'm sure that among the side characters and perhaps even the eventual shopkeepers if you wanna throw them in too, an appropriate candidate might pop up for every jock, but I don't think there is much point in speculating too much on it for now. That said, as a side note, in Zane's case specifically, I could perhaps see this role of emergency partner be filled up by Juno, even if she's a woman. But that's a big maybe, since again, you'd have to put into account if a romance between them will make sense thematically, and if the devs would even be willing to pair up one of the main boys in a straight relationship. Which would make sense for Zane, since he's heavily implied to be bisexual, but it might not necessarily fit into the spirit of the game, even if it only boils down to a throwaway line Zane says about going on a date with Juno tomorrow that most players will probably never unlock for themselves. But as I said, this whole mini matchmaking concept is just pure speculation. It might just be a more simple matter of the remaining jock resigning himself that he's the one that got left out and remains single, without much further explanation or need to pair even this last guy up. To recap then, the game allows for 9 jocks on jocks couple that can be paired up either romantically with the matchmaker option or sexually with the player's choice pairing feature. The former requires maximizing the affection between the jocks by using the game's social mechanic and taking part in scripted events, to eventually be rewarded with a confession scene of sorts for the match-made couple. The latter instead requires a high scoring filmy minigame combined with a minimum affection requirement and having invested enough points in the stats that allow the two jocks to be compatible. This will reward the player with a sex CG and an affection boost for the chosen pair. So that's all I have for you now. Let me know what you think, if this is a mechanic you are interested in using, or if it seems too much of a hassle, or if you just can't stand the thought of your favorite jock dating somebody that is not Ace. With that said, I've been your host Traindrop, and this has been Jock Studio's Secret Side Couples.